Sometimes you leave a room full of people and feel lonelier than when you arrived. Not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly absent. Like you were there, but not really there. Maybe you laughed at the right moments. Maybe you nodded. Maybe you even spoke. But somewhere underneath all of it, something felt strangely disconnected. And afterward, lying in bed with the ceiling fan spinning slowly above you, you replay it. The pauses. The moments when you weren't sure what to say. The weird feeling that maybe nobody really noticed you were there at all. Or worse, that they noticed but didn't particularly mind when you left. It's hard to explain, because nothing specific happened. Nobody rejected you. Nobody was cruel. But somehow you still came home feeling like you don't quite fit. Like everyone else speaks a language you only half understand. And maybe you felt this way for years, in different rooms, with different people. That quiet sense that belonging happens easily for everyone else, but for you, it takes work. Constant adjustment. Constant monitoring. Maybe you've even started wondering if something is fundamentally wrong with you, if other people can tell. If the feeling of not belonging is obvious to everyone except you. I'm not sure. But sometimes I think that feeling isn't loneliness exactly. Maybe it's something older, something quieter. Maybe it's the exhaustion of spending years trying to figure out where you're supposed to fit. Sometimes not belonging doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like sitting alone at lunch or being openly excluded. Sometimes it looks surprisingly ordinary. It looks like being in a group conversation and realizing you haven't spoken in 10 minutes, and nobody noticed. And when you finally say something, it lands strangely. Not wrong exactly, just slightly off. And you spend the next 3 hours replaying that moment, wondering if your tone sounded weird, if you interrupted someone, if people exchanged a look you didn't catch. Maybe they didn't. Maybe nobody thought about it at all. But you did, because somewhere along the way, you started tracking every social interaction like it's evidence. Evidence that you don't quite belong, that people tolerate you more than they choose you. And maybe that sounds paranoid. Maybe it is. But sometimes you catch yourself doing things that feel exhausting in ways you can't fully explain. Adjusting your personality slightly, depending on who's in the room. Laughing a little harder at jokes that aren't that funny. Agreeing with opinions you don't really hold. Going quiet when the conversation shifts to topics you actually care about, because sharing them feels risky. Like revealing too much might confirm what you already suspect. That you're different in ways people don't particularly like. And the strange part is, sometimes you do connect. Sometimes conversations feel easy. Sometimes you leave social situations feeling lighter. But those moments never seem to stick. The awkward ones do. The moments when you said something and the energy shifted. When someone looked at their phone mid-sentence. When you walked into a room and the conversation kept going as if you weren't there. Maybe those moments don't mean anything. But they feel like they mean everything. Because underneath all of it is this quiet, persistent feeling that other people have something you don't. Some invisible ease. Some natural sense of where they fit. And you've tried. You've tried being funnier, quieter, more confident, more agreeable. You've tried matching energy. You've tried being yourself. But somehow, no matter what version of you shows up, the feeling stays. That uncomfortable awareness that you're performing. That belonging, for you, requires constant effort. Constant recalibration, while everyone else just exists. And afterward, when you're finally alone, there's this strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because you don't have to try anymore. Sadness because trying didn't seem to work anyway. Maybe you even catch yourself scrolling through your phone at 1 a.m., looking at photos of people who seem effortlessly included. People laughing together. People who apparently never wonder if they belong. And you feel something tighten in your chest. Not jealousy, exactly. More like confirmation. That the feeling you've been carrying around for years might be accurate. That maybe you really don't belong. Not because anyone said it, but because your nervous system has been quietly collecting evidence for as long as you can remember. Here's something that might sound strange. Sometimes the feeling of not belonging has nothing to do with the people in the room. Sometimes it started years before you even walked in, not because something catastrophic happened, but because somewhere along the way you learned that belonging isn't guaranteed, that it has to be earned, that being yourself might not be enough. And maybe that lesson came quietly. Maybe it came from being the kid whose interests didn't match everyone else's, or the one who got picked last, or the one whose excitement was met with silence just often enough to notice. Maybe it came from moving schools, changing friend groups, watching people drift away without explanation. Or maybe it came from nowhere specific at all. Just 1,000 tiny moments that taught you the same thing. Belonging is conditional. And once you learn that lesson, it doesn't really leave. Because your brain starts doing something it thinks is helpful. It starts scanning, monitoring, looking for signs that you're about to be excluded again. And it gets good at finding them. A delayed text becomes evidence. A conversation you weren't invited to becomes confirmation. Someone laughing slightly less at your joke becomes proof. Not because those things actually mean rejection, but because your nervous system is trying to protect you from something it remembers hurting before, even if you don't consciously remember when. And so you adjust. You become careful. You learn to read rooms. You develop versions of yourself that feel safer, less vulnerable, less likely to be rejected. You build what feels like protection, but somewhere underneath, it starts to feel like distance. Because the version of you that feels safe around people isn't always the version that feels real. And that creates this impossible situation. You want to belong. But belonging requires being seen, and being seen feels dangerous. So you show up, but not completely. You connect, but not fully. You're there, but also not there. And people might sense that distance without understanding it. They might experience you as slightly closed off, slightly hard to reach. Not because you don't care, but because some part of you learned that caring too much, wanting too much, being too much, all of those things come with risk. The risk of finding out, once again, that you don't quite fit. And maybe that sounds like overthinking? Maybe it is. But sometimes I think people who feel like they don't belong aren't actually being rejected as often as they fear. Sometimes they're just exhausted. Exhausted from years of trying to figure out the invisible rules everyone else seems to know instinctively. Exhausted from managing how they come across. Exhausted from the gap between who they are and who they think they need to be to stay. And after a while, that exhaustion starts to feel like proof. Proof that belonging, for them, will always require more effort than it's worth. But maybe that's not actually true. Maybe the problem isn't that you don't belong. Maybe the problem is that you've been trying to belong while hiding the parts of you that actually matter. And I know that sounds like a contradiction. Because those parts, the real ones, feel like exactly the parts people won't accept. But what if the feeling of not belonging isn't about being wrong? What if it's about being tired? tired of performing, tired of adjusting, tired of never knowing if people like who you actually are, or just the version you've learned to show them. And here's where it gets complicated. Because part of you desperately wants to be known, really known, not the polished version, not the careful one, not the version that monitors every word before it leaves your mouth. The messy one, the uncertain one, the version that thinks strange things and cares about things other people might not understand. But another part of you is terrified of exactly that. Terrified that if people saw that version, they'd confirm what you've quietly suspected all along, that you're too much, or not enough, or just different in ways that don't translate well. So you end up stuck in this impossible middle ground, wanting closeness but keeping distance, craving belonging but sabotaging it before it has a chance to hurt, showing up to things while already planning your exit. And maybe you've noticed this pattern. Maybe you've caught yourself pulling away right when things start to feel good. When someone gets a little too close, when a friendship begins to deepen in ways that feel vulnerable. Not because you don't want it, but because some part of you has learned that wanting things too much makes losing them unbearable. So you protect yourself by leaving first, by staying surface level, by convincing yourself you didn't really want to belong there anyway. And afterward, you feel strangely relieved and devastated at the same time. Relieved because you avoided the rejection you were expecting. Devastated because you just reinforced the exact loneliness you were trying to escape. It's exhausting, because you're not just managing how other people see you, you're managing the war inside yourself, the part that wants to be chosen versus the part that's already bracing for rejection. The part that wants to share who you really are versus the part that believes doing so will only confirm you don't belong. The part that craves connection versus the part that finds it terrifying. And maybe nobody sees this conflict. Maybe you've gotten so good at hiding it that people think you're fine. Distant, maybe. A little hard to read. But fine. They don't see the hours you spend replaying interactions, the mental gymnastics of trying to figure out what went wrong, the quiet certainty that somehow, once again, you failed at something everyone else finds effortless. And the cruelest part? Sometimes you do find places where you feel like you belong. Moments when the mask drops, when conversation flows easily, when you feel genuinely seen. But those moments feel fragile, like they could disappear at any second. Like one wrong word, one misread tone, one awkward silence could shatter the whole thing. So even when you're included, you're waiting. Waiting for the moment it ends. Waiting for people to realize you're not actually who they thought you were. Waiting for the belonging to reveal itself as temporary. And that hypervigilance, that constant scanning for signs of rejection, becomes its own kind of loneliness. Because you can't fully relax into connection when part of you is always watching for the exit. You can't fully trust belonging when you're already preparing for it to disappear. And maybe that's the real wound underneath all of this. Not that you don't belong, but that you've never felt safe enough to stay long enough to find out if you could. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, the feeling gets clearer. Not better, just clearer. You're lying there in the dark, and you can feel it. That familiar heaviness in your chest. The one that doesn't have a name but shows up after every social interaction that felt slightly off. And you start replaying things again, not because you want to, but because your brain won't let it go. That moment when you said something and nobody responded. The joke that landed wrong. The conversation you tried to join but somehow couldn't find your way into. And you know rationally that these things probably don't matter, that everyone else is likely forgotten, that you're the only one still thinking about it. But knowing that doesn't make it stop. Because it's not really about those specific moments anyway. It's about what they represent. Every awkward pause, every delayed text. Every time someone made plans without thinking to include you, they all become evidence of the same thing, that you're on the outside, that belonging, for you, will always feel just slightly out of reach. And maybe you've tried talking about this before. Maybe you've tried explaining it to someone, but the words never come out right. Because how do you explain that you feel lonely even when you're surrounded by people? That you feel invisible even when people are looking directly at you? That you feel like you don't belong even in spaces where nobody has actually excluded you? It sounds paranoid, dramatic, like you're making problems that don't exist, so you stop trying to explain, and the feeling stays. Quiet, persistent, familiar. Like a low hum you've learned to live with. And some nights are worse than others. Some nights you scroll through your phone and see people who seem effortlessly connected. People who never seem to wonder if they're too much or not enough. People who just exist without all this internal monitoring. And you feel that tightness in your chest again, that mix of longing and resignation. Wanting what they have. Convinced you'll never have it, not because you don't try, but because trying hasn't worked. You've adjusted, you've performed, you've done everything you thought you were supposed to do, and still that feeling follows you, into every room, every friendship, every moment when you should feel included but somehow don't. And maybe you're tired. Not just physically tired, emotionally tired. Tired of carrying this weight, tired of wondering what's wrong with you, tired of the gap between how you feel and how everyone else seems to feel, tired of not belonging in places where you desperately want to. And the hardest part? You don't even know what would fix it. Because it's not about other people changing. It's not about finding the right group or the right place. It's something inside you, something that whispers, quietly, relentlessly, you don't fit. You never have. You never will. And maybe tonight, lying there in the dark, you believe it. Maybe you've believed it for years. Maybe that belief has shaped everything, how you show up, how you hide, how you leave before anyone has a chance to reject you. I don't know. But sometimes I think the feeling of not belonging isn't about being wrong. Sometimes it's just about being tired of trying to be right. But maybe there's something worth noticing here. Something small. Not a solution exactly, just a different way of looking at it. Because what if the feeling of not belonging isn't proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you? What if it's proof that you care deeply about connection? That belonging matters to you in ways it might not matter to people who take it for granted. And I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't make the feeling disappear. But maybe it shifts something. Because people who don't care about belonging don't spend hours replaying. Conversations, they don't monitor their tone. They don't adjust themselves in rooms full of strangers. They don't feel that ache when they're excluded. But you do. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it just means you're wired to notice things other people miss. The subtle shifts in energy. The moments when connection deepens or fractures. The quiet ways people signal acceptance or distance. You're not imagining those things. You're just more attuned to them than most people are. And that attunement, that sensitivity, it comes with a cost. Because when you notice everything, you feel everything. Every missed connection feels bigger. Every awkward moment stays longer. Every small rejection touches something deeper. But here's what I think happens. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that noticing these things meant you were broken, that needing connection this much meant you were too much, that feeling this deeply meant something was wrong with you, and so you tried to fix it by hiding, by performing, by becoming whatever version of yourself seemed safest. But what if you were never broken in the first place? What if you were just trying to survive in spaces that didn't know how to hold all of you? And I don't mean that in some abstract, poetic way. I mean it literally. Some people, some spaces, aren't built for depth. They're built for surface-level ease, for small talk, for connections that don't require too much emotional labor. And when you show up to those spaces carrying all this emotional awareness, all this need for real connection, of course it feels like you don't belong. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the fit was never right to begin with. And maybe the exhaustion you feel isn't from failing at belonging. Maybe it's from trying to belong in places that were never going to feel like home. Which doesn't mean you're supposed to be alone. It just means the kind of belonging you're looking for might not look the way you thought it would. It might not be loud or obvious or effortless. It might be quiet, selective, earned through vulnerability instead of performance. It might require finding people who also feel too much, who also overthink, who also know what it's like to spend years wondering if they're the problem. And maybe you haven't found those people yet. Or maybe you have, but you've been so busy hiding that they haven't found you either. I'm not sure. But I think there's a difference between not belonging and not having found your place yet. And maybe right now, in this moment, that distinction doesn't change how you feel. Maybe you still feel just as lonely, just as tired, just as convinced that something about you doesn't translate well to other people. And that's okay. You don't have to fix it tonight. You don't have to suddenly believe you belong. But maybe you can hold this one small thing. The feeling of not belonging doesn't mean you're unworthy of it. It just means you haven't felt safe enough to stop performing long enough to find out who stays when you do. I don't know if this helps. I don't know if anything I've said changes how you feel right now. Maybe you're still lying there in the dark, still replaying that conversation, still feeling like you don't quite fit anywhere. And that's okay, because some feelings don't disappear just because we understand them better. Sometimes understanding just makes them a little easier to carry, a little less shameful, a little less like proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. And maybe that's enough for tonight. Not fixing it, not solving it, just knowing that the feeling makes sense, that it came from somewhere real, that you're not broken for feeling it. You're just human. Human in ways that hurt sometimes. Human in ways that notice too much and feel too deeply and care too much about whether people really see you. And maybe other people don't talk about this. Maybe they don't spend nights like this wondering why belonging feels so hard. Or maybe they do. Maybe more people than you realize carry some version of this same weight. They just hide it as carefully as you do. And so everyone ends up feeling alone in the exact same way. Convinced they're the only one. Convinced everyone else has it figured out. When really, we're all just doing our best to belong somewhere. To someone. To ourselves. I'm not sure. But I hope you know this. The fact that you feel this deeply doesn't make you too much. The fact that you notice these things doesn't make you broken. The fact that belonging feels hard doesn't mean you're unworthy of it. It just means you're still looking, still trying, still hoping, even when hope feels difficult. And maybe that's the bravest thing. Not giving up on connection even when connection has hurt you. Not giving up on belonging even when belonging has felt impossible. Not giving up on yourself even when yourself has felt like the problem. So tonight, if you're lying there feeling like you don't fit anywhere, you're not alone in that. And you're not wrong for feeling it. You're just tired. And maybe that's okay. Maybe being tired doesn't mean you failed. Maybe it just means you've been trying for a very long time. And maybe tomorrow, or next week, or next year, maybe you'll find a place that feels less exhausting. A person who makes belonging feel easier. A version of yourself that doesn't require so much hiding. Or maybe not. Maybe the feeling stays. But maybe, at least for tonight, it feels a little less like your fault. A little more like something that makes sense, a little more like something you can carry without shame. And maybe that's enough.